Yes, there is yet more to learn about public speaking from my basement studio. This is probably one of the more important things, although I think it's all important because I really like public speaking and I like to teach public speaking. We are going to take a look at analyzing the audience. Again, I'm using Dr. Stephen Lucas's textbook, The Art of Public Speaking, and this is chapter 6. Why do I say that analyzing the audience is probably the most important part? Well, because if you don't know who's in your audience, who cares what you're doing with analyzing? Or who cares what you're doing with speaking? So, every speech should be audience-centered. The audience should be foremost in your mind during the speech preparation and presentation. Just like you guys should be more in the forefront of my mind during this presentation. Let's see if I can get the slide to advance. Not sure what the deal is here. There we go. Okay, so how do we decide if we are being audience-centered other than entertaining the audience while you're trying to make the slide move forward? All right, so audience-centered means that we should ask ourselves, to whom am I speaking? What do I want them to know, believe, or do? And what is the most effective way of accomplishing that? How do we do these things? Well, one of the ways to not do these things is to be egocentric. I'll tell you a little bit about being egocentric in just a second. But if you remember back a couple of chapters ago, I talked about being ethnocentric. So thinking that your ethnicity, your background, your group was better than all of the rest. Egocentrism is a similar idea. Egocentrism, though, is the tendency to be concerned with one's own values, beliefs, and well-being. Which is great if we know our own values, our own beliefs, and our own well-being. However, if we don't take into consideration the values, beliefs, and well-being of the audience, we won't be able to inform them very well, we won't be able to entertain them very well, and we definitely won't be able to persuade them very well. So, we need to conduct a demographic analysis. We have to know people's age, religion, racial, ethnic, or cultural background, their gender and or sexual orientation, and group membership. Do we need to know this about every audience? All of this information? Not necessarily, but it's good to know at least some of these things so that we don't offend the people in our audience. We want to make sure that we don't stereotype. We don't want an oversimplified image of a group, and we don't want to assume that all members of the group are alike. So, for example, when I was married, my ex-husband was very good at sewing. I am not good at sewing. He owns the sewing machine, I do not. So if you were going to include me in a presentation about sewing, I would probably be falling asleep. He, on the other hand, probably would be pretty interested in learning maybe some new sewing techniques, upgrading his sewing machine, and so on and so forth. So don't just shove us into categories, right? Now, is it okay to assume that people in an audience might have similar interests? Absolutely. But let's not oversimplify. Another example is a friend of mine that I had back in college. He was a quadriplegic. Quadriplegic means what? That he doesn't have use of his 4 limbs and he's in a wheelchair. Well, technically, my friend was considered a 3/4 quadriplegic, so he had use of his body from here up. Not a paraplegic because he did have limited movement of his left hand. Paraplegic would be you have use of 2 of your limbs but not all of your limbs. So I often asked my students back then, what do you think his favorite activities are? And of course, they were like, well, playing on the computer, playing video games, reading, all those things that we think quadriplegics should be able to do, right? Well, that's kind of wrong. He actually was more interested in things like downhill skiing, hunting, horseback riding, playing wheelchair basketball, playing wheelchair rugby. There were so many things that he was involved in as far as physical sports go. He also really liked dancing to country music. So we need to keep those things in mind. We can't just stuff people into a category because it seems easiest for us. Can we assume sometimes that groups of people have things in common? Like maybe that all Catholics have a certain thing in common, or maybe all Muslims have a certain thing in common? Sure, we could make some generalizations like that. But we can't just stuff everybody into a category. Maybe we're saying that all Catholics are way too strict for Christianity, or that all Muslims always do 5 prayers a day and they always do them at the exact same time. Now, if they're a good Muslim, they probably do 5 prayers a day, but they maybe don't always do them at the exact same time, because there are general guidelines when it comes to saying those 5 prayers a day. They are not a specific, you say one at 5 a.m., you say one at 8 a.m., you say one at noon. That's really kind of left up to the particular Muslim. Anywho, we want to make sure that we know the demographics of our audience, but that we are not stereotyping them. We also need to do a situational analysis. When we're getting prepared to speak, we need to know the size of the audience, the physical setting that we'll be speaking in, the disposition of the audience toward the topic, the disposition of the audience toward the speaker, and the disposition of the audience toward the occasion. Are people excited and happy to be there? Is it a celebration? Is it a wedding reception? Is it a graduation party? Is it a graduation ceremony? We need to know what their disposition is. What does disposition mean? It sounds really cool, doesn't it? It just means, are people happy? Are they excited? Are they sad? Are they angry? Any of those things fit into this category of disposition. And we need to do a situational analysis. If I'm speaking to you from my basement studio, that's completely different than if I was speaking on a stage in front of 3,000 people. I have to be prepared for the group for which I'm speaking. You also need to keep the audience's interest in mind. And this is an example from Dr. Lucas's textbook. If you'd like to, you can certainly go and look it up, check it out on the PowerPoint at your discretion. But we want to keep the audience's attention, keep them interested. Why do I tell you stories that relate to public speaking, or relate to stereotyping, or relate to egocentrism? Because otherwise, these lectures would be kind of boring. And you wouldn't want to look at them. In fact, you might watch the first 1 or 2 and then forget the rest. Well, if I'm going to take my time in doing these, I better be ready for the audience and keep you interested.
Next.
Attitude. Attitude is keeping in mind the frame of mind in favor of or opposed to a particular person, policy, belief, institution, etc. So this happens often for professional speakers in the form of politics, right? It's pretty easy. Do people like or dislike the politician or government official? Are they opposed to or in favor of the policies that that person is championing? Do they have similar beliefs to that person? And do they believe in the institution, not a physical building necessarily, but the institution of the Republican or Democratic political party? Or do they have a completely different outlook? What are people's attitudes, positive or negative? We want to adapt to audience attitudes. Again, there's an example here for you to look at if you would like to do that. So, how do we find all this out? How do we get to know who's in our audience? we should ask them questions. There's the fixed alternative questions, there's scale questions, and there's open-ended questions. Fixed alternative questions. Do you know what gerrymandering is in the U.S. political system? Yes, no, or I'm not sure. Those are your 3 answers. A scale question, you've probably seen this before, often referred to as a Likert scale or a Likert type scale. This is how often do you believe state legislatures engage in gerrymandering? Very seldom to very often, with marks in the middle. Usually these are indicated by numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sometimes it can go all the way up to 10. Those are definitely used in statistical analysis, but to be a public speaker, you don't necessarily need to do statistical analysis. You can just summarize the data and determine who is in your audience. Open-ended questions are my favorite kind of questions. These are something like, who do you think should set the boundaries of congressional districts? State legislatures, the courts, independent commissions, or some other option? This is not quite as open-ended as I like to use, but you can definitely allow them to just answer however it best fits the people in the audience. Sometimes I might just say, what do you think about gerrymandering? What do you think about redistricting for state legislatures? What do you think about redistricting for congresses or congressional districts? Who do you think might be the best candidate for the next school board election? Those things would be better open-ended questions. It allows for them to actually come up with ideas on their own. You can also use questionnaires. You can use the scale questions, you can use the closed-ended questions, or you can use open-ended questions. But it is a good way to find out about your audience. This is something I do with my other in-class classes. I allow them to answer some questions on a questionnaire. I've also had students give surveys to the class to find out some information about them. Okay, so how do you adapt to this audience that you just learned a little bit about? First, let me back up just slightly. So you can do 2 types of audience analyses. You can do the direct or the indirect. You can actually ask the audience about themselves using the information we just reviewed, or you can ask the person who asked you to speak to tell you a little bit about the audience. So if somebody asked you to speak for the local FFA, you could probably assume that the students want to know something having to do with agriculture. Their interest is probably in agriculture. Or maybe you assume that their interest is in something to do with leadership. Absolutely. Both of those 2 things would be right. If you don't know anything about the organization, maybe it's the local FCCLA or local FBLA, and you can't make an assumption about what those people might be interested in, ask the person who asked you to speak. Did their advisor ask you to speak? Ask him or her what the audience is going to be like. So that is an indirect audience analysis. And you can also do the direct audience analysis, like we just mentioned, asking actual questions of the people in your audience, if you have access to the audience. So how do you adapt to the audience before the speech? You try to assess how you think the audience will respond. You might even try to come up with a list of questions you think that they might have or they might ask, and that way you can respond to them. And then you want to adjust your speech to make it clear and convincing. How do you know if you've adjusted it appropriately? How do you know if somebody else might understand it? Remember back when we talked about practicing in front of our friends, in front of our family members? That's a good way to know if your speech will be understood by other people. During the speech, you also must adapt to the audience. You want to adjust for unexpected circumstances and watch for feedback. So if people look really bored, change it up. If people look like they're becoming hostile or agitated, change something. If you have somebody who keeps talking and interrupting you, you also might want to change it up a little bit. Those are the unexpected circumstances. So you need to figure out, okay, how would I best deal with somebody who's asking me questions or who is interrupting me? How is it best that I can deal with that person? An example that I might be able to give is if somebody keeps interrupting, I can go ahead and give them my attention because that's what they want, and then take that attention away and say, I would love to visit with you or chat with you after I'm done with this presentation, or if you would please write down some of your questions so that you can ask them later, I'd appreciate that as well. I've dealt with the person, I've given them the attention that they're asking for, and yet I can continue on with my speech or my presentation. Adapting to the audience is probably one of the most important parts of speaking. Why? Because they're who you're speaking to. Again, remember back to our listening chapter. If there's nobody listening, there's no point in you talking.